Welcome to Not Local. My name is Zeke Harker. My guest today is Sam Kelly. Sam is originally from New Zealand and came to the United States on a student visa to study engineering at Duke University. He is the CPO of Fauna Labs and Director of Conservation Technology at Conservation X Labs. Sam and I talk about life in New Zealand, the process of acquiring different U.S. visas, how living on a U.S. visa can complicate life, and other topics. Now I give you Sam Kelly. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to just start on your background. I know you grew up in New Zealand, so can you tell me a little bit about, what your childhood was like, what it was like to grow up in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a town called Rotorua. It's a relatively small town. I mean, it's big by New Zealand standards, I guess, in some ways. It's like 80,000 people, something like that. It's a bit of a tourist town, actually. So a lot of the cultural and some of the kind of outdoor adventure stuff is around, centered around Rotorua in New Zealand. And it doesn't really, it's a relatively blue collar town, I would say. There's no university there. A lot of the schools are, if you're relatively wealthy, a lot of my friends ended up boarding elsewhere. And that's not to say the schools in Rotorua are great, but I think it was a town that gave a lot for me in terms of experiences, but perhaps from the outside, other people would say I often get, you're from Rotorua, it's a place that stinks because there's a bunch of geothermal activity and the like. So, yeah, it was an interesting place to grow up. A lot of outdoor focused activities and sports. So there's lakes where I learned to fly fish, which continues to be a passion of mine. I played a lot of cricket growing up, as well as a bunch of other sports, but perhaps a little less seriously than cricket. So, yeah, it was just I have a younger brother, 18 months younger than me, and so yeah, it was pretty cool upbringing. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else specific.
Yeah. That's all really interesting and helpful. You said it was a little bit of a tourist attraction. What was the tourism there about? Was it just for New Zealand generally? That's one of the cities people go to, or is there a specific?
Yeah, it's kind of like, if I was to say, there's two towns in New Zealand that are like tourism hotspots. So Queenstown, the South Island, and then Rotorua would be its equivalent, I would say, in many ways, in the North Island. Although there are other places in the North Island as well, but Rotorua is kind of centered around this idea of, initially it was cultural. So the Māori, the native people of New Zealand, there a lot of the cultural center happens around around Rotorua, and so there's lots of kind of tourism around that. But then I think in the last kind of 20 to 30 years, there's been a big emergence of adventure sports being something that Rotorua hosts. So we had the World Mountain Biking Championships come through. The mountain bike is a big scene in Rotorua. And then, whitewater rafting and whitewater kayaking are also a really big part of the tourism in Rotorua. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the main attractions. I mean, you could also do some more niche things. It's very well known for trout fishing. And some of the lake activities as well.
That's great. And then you came to the United States originally for a degree in engineering. So how did that come about?
Yeah, and I'd say this is relatively uncommon. I think this is also something that I think is changing, and so this may no longer be true. But I graduated high school in 2013, and people just didn't go to the U.S. for college. The schools, the universities in New Zealand are actually pretty good. I mean, obviously they're less expensive as well. And so there just wasn't a culture around going overseas for at least the undergraduate degree. But there were some scholarships that I was aware of. There was a woman, I guess like 2 to 3 years above me, got one of these scholarships that went to Oxford. So there was two run by New Zealand universities, like the kind of association. And 2 of them went to Oxford, and 1 went to Duke and UNC. And that one that went to Duke and UNC was called the Robertson Scholarship. And I applied to all 3 of those scholarships, and I guess was lucky enough to get selected for the Robertson Scholarship. And that's kind of what set me up to come here. I had no intention, to be honest, of coming unless that scholarship was available. It was honestly like the only reason I knew about America as an option. I mean, I knew that Duke was a really well-regarded school, but beyond that, it was not necessarily something that is culturally relevant, should we say, in New Zealand. So I didn't know about the sports situation, didn't know about what the school specialized in, etc. But I was pretty keen to kind of see if I could make it work in the US. I was relatively ambitious as a high schooler, I guess.
Nice. You definitely got an interesting university experience going to Duke, because I will tell you that every university does not have the reputation of Duke, does not have the same sports reputation as Duke. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I definitely looked into that one. It's got a good vibe of both, like the academic side of things, and then also having the basketball was pretty awesome. So
yeah, no doubt. So you graduate from Duke in 2017?
2018. Yeah.
Okay. And then your next gig is, I know you because you work with my stepfather, Dave, with Fauna, and but you have something else, right? It's you're working for Conservation X.
Yeah, that's correct. So I graduated in 2018, and I had started a student group actually when I was at Duke called Duke Conservation Tech, and it was really born around this idea that I think there's, at least this is probably not so true anymore, but at the same time there was this perhaps lack of engagement from engineering into the space of environmental sciences, conservation, environment, the environment, climate, etc. And so we started this group that basically tried to match undergraduate students, engineering students, with projects that were ongoing in that kind of space, perhaps groups like we had an early project with World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and they wanted to investigate like LEDs as a form of decreasing bycatch for sea turtles for gillnet fishing. And so I kind of got into the space of technology for wildlife conservation, and that's actually how I met Dave as well, where we had this harebrained idea of trying to make, and this is funny saying it now, it was probably in 2016, something like that. The idea of creating like an open source whale tag that would essentially be, something that an undergraduate could learn some technical engineering skills and basically build one of these tags that could be used for research. I mean, me and Dave are still working on this 8 years later. We'll probably loop round back to that, but that was the kind of project we were involved with. And so one of the kind of preeminent groups in that space, there was a group called Conservation X Labs. It's a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., and their idea is basically using technology and innovation and I guess open market approaches to trying to address the underlying what Conservation X Labs calls the underlying drivers of extinction. So not only creating protected areas and the things that are necessary to halt some of the or slow some of the biodiversity loss, but actually kind of start to address some of those reasons why the biodiversity loss is actually occurring. So what are the leading causes of climate change? What are the underlying market drivers of poaching and the like? So I was pretty drawn to that. So I started that job in 2018. and worked on the 2 engineering projects that were developed internally. So it was a handheld genetic diagnostic tool called the NABBIT, which is designed to give rapid genetic tests that were similar to PCR quality in less than 15 minutes. And the idea was that you could use it for enforcement purposes. And then I founded a project called Sentinel, which is basically an AI-enabled camera trap that's satellite connected. And the idea there is that a lot of the management of super remote areas is not really possible. So if you have a protected area or you're doing some kind of active management of a really remote place, you're relying on monitoring methods that are delayed to a point where you're not really actively managing. And that results in things like you miss poaching events, you miss an ability to do effective invasive species removal, and or simply biodiversity monitoring. So I was involved with 2 of those projects. And then recently, as in the last month or so, I actually resigned from my full-time role there and have moved over to Fauna Labs full-time.
That's great. Wow, I did not know the full extent of Conservation X, but that's pretty cool. Yeah, wow, what an experience. So I'd like to start off with, you have 3 visa processes that I'm just aware of.
Sure.
You may have gone through more than that, but the first one, I assume that the scholarship that you were awarded did not also include a student visa to the United States. So
No, that's correct.
Started with that.
Yeah, and so I had to, obviously, once I got offered the scholarship, I had to get into Duke. Still, I went through a bit of a weird, non-standard process. Normally it's the other way around, but I had to get into Duke. And once I got into Duke, obviously, I got an F1 visa, which is relatively standard. Basically, you just have to show your enrollment, and you get the papers from Duke. It's very nice, actually, because Duke has a whole visa office that helps out with all of that. So that was pretty straightforward. And I guess the relevant things there were that, under the F1, if you wanted to do any type of internship, you had to go through these OPTs, which I can't remember what they actually stand for now. Optional practical training or something like that. So when I did internships, there's a whole process that did take quite a while and was relatively challenging to set up, but had the resources at Duke to kind of help me out, file the right paperwork and get the relevant documentation and the like. So that was my first thing. And that was an F1, and that's obviously valid during the time of my undergraduate degree. So that's 4 years of undergraduate. But then because it's in a STEM field, you get this after graduation period. So you typically have, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but basically there's a amount of time you get if you're just a standard, F1, and then you get this extension as well if you have a STEM degree, basically. And it ends up being actually quite a long time after graduation. You can still be on an F1. So a lot of my early work at Conservation X Labs was actually done on an F1 visa. And actually, I would probably say I was 2.5 years in before I had to move on to the next one. So yeah,
that I believe is very intentional too. I know the United States does have the idea is to keep all the people who are doing getting educations in things that they term to be useful or help in the future. And, if you can get an education in one of those things and, you have some value in society, or what the government deems valuable in society, then we want you here. Yeah. So, all right. The next one, I believe, for being able to work in the United States is an H-1B, right?
Yeah. So once I was approaching the end of my F1, I was in a little bit of a unique situation because I worked, and this is non-standard because I worked at what qualifies as a nonprofit research institution. And what that means is that I didn't have to win the lottery, which is typical of most people going on the H-1B. It's basically exempt from the lottery process. So that was because I had a proven relationship with Duke University. I was working closely with the Nowacek lab at Duke. It was actually Dave's PhD advisor, Doug Nowacek, and so that qualified me to basically forego the lottery and start the H-1B process. So I moved to H-1B, this exemption, and I was on the H-1B for that period, and then I did renew it as well. And this happened actually during COVID, so it was a little bit weird as well because, I found out. This is an interesting thing, I think, that I found out was that, you get your paperwork from the I-797, which is like your notice of action, which gives you status, but that's not your visa. And so like I had this, weird in-between times where I was doing some research or doing some work down in Costa Rica, but I couldn't re-enter the U.S. even though I had paperwork. I did not have the paperwork which would clear me through customs, so I had to go back to New Zealand, and that whole process was really backed up in, what was that, 2020, because obviously all of the embassies and all the consulates had shut down during COVID. So that was kind of that was like a big kind of management of my visa that my company had to do. We had to figure out, when can we send Sam out of the States, because then he can't come back until he visits New Zealand and gets the visa paperwork process. So I was on the H-1B from then on until very recently when I got my next visa.
Nice. So, that COVID time was just diplomatic purgatory for people who were in complex visa situations or didn't have citizenship status in their host country.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, right? So this is one thing I was not aware of because on the F1, your visa is granted clearly throughout the entire time you have the visa. And so when I was on the H-1B and changed status, I had to go back to my home country, which was during COVID. New Zealand was on lockdown, so even me getting back into my own country was tough. Yeah. We had to wait till the borders opened from even for New Zealand citizens to be able to go back, because that was on a lottery system to even get back as a New Zealander. So, so we did investigate getting the visa paperwork filed in a third country. So we were looking at Germany and South Korea and some weird places that had some capacity to accept third-party visas and stuff. But it was, a third-country visas. But, it was like a really tough part of that whole process. So,
unique moment in time, especially for all that. But
I think so. I think that was relatively unusual, partly because I couldn't even get back to my own country for most of that time.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it would have been a heck of a time to be working in a consular's office for any country. But,
yeah.
All right, so the next one is an O1. I'm assuming yours is an O1A.
I believe so. I should really know that, but yes, I believe
it's the one for science. So I'm imagining that's right.
Yeah. And so, that one has been a process in the making for a while. So one of the downsides, I guess, of the H-1B process I went through is that because I didn't win the lottery, I couldn't transfer my visa in ways that people normally can if they're on one that has won the lottery. So I can't, for example, if I got a job offer from, let's say I got a job offer from Google or someone like that, I couldn't move there because I'm under this nonprofit exemption and I hadn't won the lottery. Right. So actually Dave and I had, through Fauna Labs, attempted to do an H-1B lottery and lost that. In 2022 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so we lost that, and the odds are 30-odd%. So we decided that it was best just to invest a little bit more money and do the O1 process instead. And so I started it in probably January of 2023. So a long time ago now. And so I engaged a lawyer that specialized in these kind of visas, specifically like startup O1s. And so that was super helpful because, that's one thing that was also a challenge of the H-1B is like this concept of being a startup founder is not really what the H-1B is designed to be for. The H-1B, you have to be an employee. You have to be, quote unquote, fireable. And so the O1 is a much better visa, to be honest, anyway, for that. So was excited to start that process, but there's a lot of gathering of evidence during that time. Had to get a bunch of evidence I had to get 10 categories, and I had to prove that I was exceptional in 3 of them. And so there's a lot of there was some weird situations. Like I called up some old friends asking for photos of me getting awards in college that I didn't even have the photos for, but I knew they took photos at the assembly because they needed that kind of evidence. So there's just a lot of time. I think my application in the end ended up being like 500 pages, something like that. So it was a big process, but yeah, I think it was exciting once we finally submitted it. There was a little bit of a hiccup in my process in that they asked for additional evidence. So there was essentially a second round where we had to gather additional evidence to kind of allay some of the concerns perhaps from the first officers. So was finally granted that maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago now. So excited to kind of start with the next phase here.
Yeah, no doubt. It sounds like through all 3 of these that the O1 is the one where you were vetted the most. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and to be fair, that was the process where I was the most involved. Okay. And so it's possible, for example, I've seen my H-1B application. I know there's a lot of work that went into it, but I was kind of shielded from that by my employer. So it's a little bit unclear, but I believe, I was asking old colleagues for letters of recommendation and things like that I didn't have to do for the H-1.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Little bit more general question here. But before you decided to go pursue an education in the United States, what was your just general perception of the United States of America, what the U.S. is in the world, and, versus maybe your perception of New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I'd written some more of this down because I feel like it's hard to go back and do this now. But I do have some key memories of things. I think I viewed America as kind of the cultural center of, I guess you could call it, the Western world. This is even more true now when I go back to New Zealand. But the sports were followed, so we wouldn't be watching regular season NFL games, but the Super Bowl was on TV. Obviously all of the movies came from America. All of the music came from America. And so very much cultural connection to the U.S. I think as far as anything more than that, I had no clue. And I think if you'd asked me, I remember when I turned up to North Carolina, I was shocked that it was so green. Because honestly, and this might sound ignorant, I like to think I was relatively well read, but my impression of the U.S. when I stopped and think about it was there's L.A., New York, and then maybe Texas. But the rest of it is corn or or the desert. And it never really even crossed my mind what a small to medium sized city would even be like. And so I very much would call I guess my understanding of the U.S. was pretty influenced by the media that I was consuming, which was honestly not news. It was just the movies and the TV shows, really. So that was kind of how we saw it, to be honest.
Yeah, this is definitely my favorite question to ask everyone who I'm interviewing for this, because I just the answers I get are just so wonderful, and it's the same experience for me when I go visit any other country. I have this idea in my head,
yeah,
and it's never that. It's always something. Even if it's similar, it's always something different. And
yeah, you realize how surface level the before going it impressions were.
Yeah,
I mean, there is an impression from the outside of Americans being, quite honestly, loud and obnoxious. That was kind of the culture. Like, if you were to pinpoint how that was, and I know that to be not true anymore. I think, I think there is I wish some of the American idealism would trickle back to New Zealand a little bit more. The confidence, I think personally, my personality changed a little bit when I came here, because in New Zealand, I don't know if this is something that is widespread, but we have this saying called tall poppy syndrome, and the concept is, like, in a field of poppy flowers, the tall ones get chopped down to size. Mm-hmm. No one stands out from the rest. And that is kind of the culture in New Zealand. It's very low key, and I still appreciate this to this day. Is, everyone's low key, everyone's humble. But I think that does prevent some, exceptional, like people chasing the thing they really want to do. And that was, it's been pretty cool for me to experience that in the US. It's certainly something I'd bring back to New Zealand as far as cultural differences.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It certainly is like that. And it's encouraged, I would say, in the United States in some places more than others, right? Like there's many places where you'll find you'll see it most in cities, I think, where the culture is to be different, and being different is like, everyone is so different here that it's sort of just the standard. Like, I'm in the New York City metro area right now. Every time I get on the subway, it's just a cacophony of different people. And it's always like that in the cities, but it's definitely not everywhere though. So that's an interesting observation.
And I think, I got to realize where I've spent most of my time in the U.S. I went to an elite university. I've spent most of my time in Seattle and Washington, D.C. post those times. And so, I do like to get out and explore. Like I said, I do fly fish and I get out to rural areas, but I don't spend much time out there. So my impression of America is very much skewed, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So you had this idea of what the United States would be, and you get here and it's turns out to be slightly different. So I wanted to ask, what do you think has changed for you, having been here, having had that lived experience, meeting people from the United States, working with people in the United States? What's different now?
Yeah, apart from the fact I've lost my New Zealand accent, I like to think that I haven't changed a whole bunch, other than I feel more. I don't know. I feel like I'm a little more confident in getting out and trying something different. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I have to reflect on that one, to be honest. So.
And if it's nothing, it's nothing, or if it's a lot of things and it's just you can't really put your finger on it, like that's definitely very.
Yeah, I guess why I'm wrestling with this is I don't think it's so much the U.S. I think, yes, I met some. I got the opportunity, I would say, by being in the U.S., by the U.S. being so big, that I got to do something pretty niche in my career that really a country like New Zealand, couldn't really support at the level that I've been supported in America. To do technology for nature conservation is relatively, New Zealand is unique in that there is quite a lot of investment in that space, but it's not something that you see a whole bunch of jobs going to in New Zealand. That kind of thing, I think, is where it's really changed. And I think the other big thing is that quite honestly, being away from family has instilled a sense of like, I don't know, like self-reliance in the extreme if I was to psychoanalyze myself.
Yeah, sure.
In that I do think like I have, really learned to rely on myself for everything just because I'm out here. And I think that has changed me quite a lot versus if I'd been around people I grew up with, et cetera, a lot more closely. So I think those are more of the differences I've noticed, I think, from being away from home more so than, I guess, the American cultural difference. So.